In this chapter, King turns toward the contribution of an accurate assessment of ourselves to our thinking process. King starts off considering a primary way this fails: arrogance. He says on page 108, arrogance has two remarkable features. First, we hate it when we see it in others. Second, we often fail to see it in ourselves. I'll assume that at some point in your life, you've witnessed arrogance in others. Perhaps you've even had people directly afflict you with their arrogance. Is King right that we hate it when we see it in others? I think of the examples of arrogant politicians that he mentions on the first pages of the chapter. The absolute certainty and self-confidence these people display seem to be a selling point to their constituents. Apparently, there is a significant proportion of the electorate that is turned on by candidates who are arrogant. Well, at least as long as their arrogance is in line with what the supporters themselves believe. I won't assume, though, that you've had a problem with your own arrogance. If you have, however, it's worth your attention to see it for what it is, and to take steps to eliminate it. I know I've had to do that at various times in my life. I've been embarrassed to look back on my life and see that in a situation I had been acting arrogantly. I've heard the claim that it's a good thing to treat others as I would like to be treated. Since I don't want people to act arrogantly toward me, it's wise for me to watch that I don't act arrogantly toward others. Arrogance can sound like a nasty word. Sometimes we use the softer overconfidence. Sometimes we have overconfidence individually, sometimes as groups. King reminds us of Garrison Keillor's descriptive tagline for the community of Lake Wobegon, the setting for the stories he told in his radio show. Lake Wobegon was a place where women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. That's the tagline, but were you to listen to his stories, you'd notice that the imagined residents of this fictional town are pretty normal. I bet many of you know enough math to understand what it means to say all the children are above average. King gives us more on this vice of arrogance on pages 113 to 115. On page 109, King identifies three components of intellectual humility. They are an appropriate degree of attention to our intellectual weaknesses, an accurate or at least reasonable assessment of our intellectual weaknesses, that is, registering our weaknesses as weaknesses, and an effort to own our intellectual weaknesses. What do you make of these components? Are they clearly stated? Have you been aware of their presence in your life? Notice how measured they are, how he avoids absolutist language. The first component, our attention to our intellectual weaknesses, is done to an appropriate degree. There are some degrees of attention to our weaknesses that are inappropriate. We don't want too much attention or too little. In the second, we want an accurate and reasonable assessment of our intellectual weaknesses. In the first, we've noticed our weaknesses and pay appropriate attention to them. Now we are considering these weaknesses as weaknesses. We are seeking to tell the truth about them and operate on the basis of that truth. Because our assessment is reasonable, we tell the truth about our weaknesses, but we don't dwell on them. We don't let our knowledge of our weaknesses, our inadequacies, control us. Once upon a time, there was a man in a church I served who was always apologizing for only having an 8th grade education. If you were to experience this man, I don't think his intellectual weaknesses would have stood out, but his recognition of them and unreasonable assessment of them limited his involvement in life. The third component has us owning our weaknesses. When we own something, in this sense, it's not saying that our weaknesses have become material objects like those we keep in our homes. Rather, we are fessing up about them. We're freely admitting that they are our weaknesses, but we're not dwelling on them, defining ourselves by them, or letting them function as excuses. The next section of the chapter covers these in greater detail. King identifies two vices that can prevent us from giving an appropriate degree of attention to our intellectual virtues and vices: vanity and pride. He goes on to early 19th century author Jane Austen for the distinction between the two. She writes, pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. From this base, King adds, prideful people are obsessed with their weaknesses, while vain people are obsessed with what others think about those weaknesses. In the section that follows on page 110, he illustrates these traits in the characters of Proud Paul and Vain Vince. What are some places you've noticed pride and vanity? What factors contribute to build them up in people's lives? Imagine you have some friends who exhibit pride or vanity. What advice would you give them as to how to overcome these traits in their lives? How might you get past the defenses that pride and vanity throw up to protect the self? Page 112, King observes a vice that goes in the opposite direction from pride and vanity: neglect. This vice leads us to care too little about the state of our knowledge or that of our intellectual skills or character. Consider King's description of neglectful Ned. Ned is, King says, happily oblivious to his intellectual weaknesses. From the story, we see that a factor for this neglect is that Ned lacks skin in the game. He has obvious and costly intellectual weaknesses, but because of his place of privilege, he doesn't see those weaknesses costing him anything. His dad owns the store where he works. Ned's negligence costs his dad in the business money, but Ned's innumeracy makes him unaware. His dad apparently doesn't hold him accountable. He experiences no cost to his intellectual vice. I see a factor here that King doesn't mention. We can inhabit networks of relationships that improve us intellectually or that harm us intellectually. Ned's father may think that he's doing Ned a favor by not holding him accountable, by shielding him from the consequences of his actions. But he's not helping Ned. Rather, he's aiding and abetting Ned in intellectual vice. When it comes to assessing our weaknesses, King encourages us to pull out our Aristotelian toolbox. If the virtue we're seeking is intellectual humility, what is it the mean between? The deficiency is arrogance. As we've seen, when we're arrogant, we have a deficiency of attention to our weaknesses. The excess is self-deprecation. Self-deprecation is where we take digs at ourselves, overestimating our weaknesses. When it comes to owning our intellectual weaknesses, King identifies the vices of laziness and denial. Neither of these practices help us or the people around us. King suggests 3 ways that we can own our weaknesses. 1, having recognized them as weaknesses, we can then correct them. 2, it might be that our weaknesses aren't something we can correct, but we can correct for them. We can build structures and practices in our lives that make up for those weaknesses. And 3, sometimes it might be that a weakness we identify has no correction and no workaround by which we could correct for it. In these cases, we may have to accept the weakness and move on. We'll have to let the areas in which we are stronger carry us. Borrowing then from Carol Dweck, King contrasts a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. The latter takes the view regarding ourselves that it is what it is. We are limited and we can't do anything about it. Our abilities are fixed. We can't grow or change, even if we want to, and work at it. The growth mindset takes the opposite approach. It assumes that in many cases, growth, change, and improvement are possible. Change for the better isn't a sure thing, but we're willing to work at it on the chance that it can happen. We don't assume that it is what it is, but instead, it may be that way now, but it need not be that way in the future. King turns now to the other side of self-assessment, self-confidence. As with intellectual humility, he identifies 3 components. You'll notice these exactly parallel the components of humility. Number 1, an appropriate degree of attention to our intellectual strengths. Number 2, an accurate or at least reasonable assessment of our intellectual strengths, registering our strengths as strengths. And number 3, an effort to own our intellectual strengths. When you turn to page 124, are you surprised to see how he lays out the way the virtue of self-confidence relates to the vices of deficiency and excess? When it comes to the virtue of intellectual humility, the state of deficiency was called arrogance. Now we see that arrogance is a state of excess for the virtue of self-confidence. Similarly, where the state of excess for intellectual humility was self-deprecation, that vice is now the vice of deficiency for the virtue of self-confidence. On pages 125 and 126, King gives us first some questions, then some suggested personal affirmations that will help us maximize the virtue of self-confidence in our lives. First, the questions. He encourages us to ask ourselves, do I ignore the views of people I take to be my intellectual inferiors? Do I think I have nothing to learn from people whose moral or political views oppose mine? Am I unwilling to read new books about a subject because I regard traditional views as the last word? Or am I unwilling to read old books about a subject just because those books are old? How do those questions fit your life? Are there ways to tweak them that would give them more application in your situation? Are there better questions you can think of that you need to ask yourself? We see the suggested affirmations at the top of page 126. He suggests that we add these affirmations to our toolbox to pull out regularly. I made a mistake and I must fix it. I'm not familiar with that idea. Can you share the basics with me? I'm a little limited in that area, but I'm working on it. I'm pretty good at this, but I have a plan to get even better. Do you notice how each of these seeks to display appropriate humility and self-confidence? People who can say these things are comfortable with themselves. They are eager to learn and improve themselves, but they don't have to defend themselves or put themselves down in the process. Have you tried these affirmations or something like them? If so, what has your experience been? If you haven't, can you imagine situations in which you could try them out? What do you think might happen?